So, you know, it was Carl Jung who popularized and differentiated the idea of archetypes. They weren't his idea. Platonic forms are archetypes essentially. Ideals are an archetype. And so, but Jung, the thing that I think he did that hadn't been done before was to suggest that, as well as suggesting, as Freud did, that human beings are composed of sub-personalities. Jung pointed out, as Freud did to some degree, that some of those personalities have a universal character, and so that they can be thought about as transcendent entities. And you could think about those, well, they have been thought about and even put forward as gods of one form or another. Now, when Jung talked about archetypes, it was never clear what he meant, and I think the reason for that was because the archetype is a very complicated idea and a very complicated phenomena, and you can think about it biologically, and you can think about it socially, and you can think about it as something that the individual participates in creating. So it's not that easy to localize it. And as well, it's not that easy to localize it. And as well, Jung was never clear about what the universe of archetypes looked like. At some times he spoke as if they were a relatively small number, and then at other times he spoke as if they were innumerable. And I think the reason for that is, in part, it depends on the level of analysis, right? The more transcendent the archetype, the fewer they are, but they differentiate, because you might say, well, how many hero archetypes are there? And one answer could be one. But they differentiate all the way out into the diverse range of works of fiction that we have. So you could say there's as many variants of the hero archetype, roughly speaking, as there are works of fiction. So you think about it as a hierarchy with the ultimate archetype at the top. So then another question might be, what does the landscape of ultimate archetypes look like? And I think that that's what I tried to lay out, and that's what I'm trying to lay out in this diagram. So now, why do you want to know that? There's a practical reason, or there's a number of practical reasons as well as intellectual reasons. One of the most relevant practical reasons, as far as I'm concerned, is that integrating narratives, and so those would include political narratives, integrating narratives have their force because they draw on universal archetypes. Otherwise they wouldn't have any power, right? Because they're basically stories. An integrating archetype, like the story that Hitler sold the Germans, or that the Germans and Hitler co-created, which is a much more accurate way of thinking about it. That had motive force because it had an archetypal essence. And so political stories derive their power from the underlying archetypal representations. Obviously, because they have to be concerned with the things that people find important, right? How can you sell a political message to someone if it isn't about something they find important? And if it's important to them, it's going to be grounded, at least to some degree, in their biological in their biological substructure. I mean, if you're talking to hungry people about food, it's a story that you can tell, right? Because it hooks them deeply. It hooks deep into their motivational systems. To use a narrative of utopia, which is the land of milk and honey, roughly speaking, a very, very old idea, you're also tapping deeply into intrinsic human longings. And so the idea that political narratives incorporate archetypal themes is not really, it's not an idea that I would consider particularly controversial. Putting it that way might be. Okay, so the problem with political narratives, in my estimation, is that they can rapidly transform themselves into ideologies, and ideologies are dangerous for a variety of reasons, but the primary reason for their danger, I think, this is a hypothesis, is because of their one-sided nature. What happens is that they capitalize, parasitize, I think is even a better way of thinking about it, a profound underlying narrative, but they don't tell the entire story. And so then if you're looking for orientation in the world because you're fragmented and chaotic, and somebody provides you with a partial story, that's going to serve an integrating function. And it's one of the things you see in psychotherapy is that if you're chaotic and confused and you go see a therapist who has a particular kind of practice, Freudian, behavioral, cognitive, Rogerian, whatever, there's a high probability that undergoing that course of therapy is going to be good for you, and that you might even come to view your life in the in the terms of that therapeutic practice. And you might say, well, why is that therapeutic practice right for you? Maybe it could have been Rogerian instead of Freudian, say. And the answer to that is, yeah, well, it probably could have been, because roughly speaking, any coherent ordering principle is better than none. And so that's also a good way to think about human development from an intellectual perspective, is that partly what has to be provided to individuals as they mature into adults is some kind of ordering structure. And this is one of the facts that people who criticize the dogmatic element of religious belief don't really understand. They don't understand that you have to provide people with a determinate structure of some type, even if it's constricting and restricting and crushing for that matter. You have to pass through a disciplinary structure before, and even in principle, you could be free. Before you're disciplined, you're not free, you're just chaotic. And so you have to practice some set of routines and rituals. Now, you could say, well, they don't necessarily have to be religious, and they could be secular. You could become a lawyer, you could become a plumber, you could become a carpenter, and I would say, yes, that's far better than not becoming anything. But the problem with an identity that isn't rooted into the archetypes is it leaves you incomplete, because the archetypal rooting of the identity is what helps you grapple with the fundamental existential problems of life. And whether you're a carpenter or a plumber or a lawyer, your soul is still going to hunger for some deeper form of identity, and you're not going to get that without having your practical identity encapsulated in something that's greater from a philosophical perspective, and perhaps even deeper than philosophy, which I think the archetypal stories are. They're the structure within which philosophy itself is embedded, and outside of that is a behavioral structure. We've talked about how those evolve. There's a behavioral evolution of something approximating a consensual morality, and then stories about that consensual morality emerge, and then inside that the structures of philosophy nest, and all of those things have to be addressed by your identity to some degree, or you're weak. That's the problem. You're beset by doubts, you're beset by anxiety, you're easy to stop, and you don't have much motivation, and none of that's good. It's not good at all, because life presents you with enough real obstacles in the face of genuine suffering, so that unless you're strongly grounded and have a real reason for moving forward, you're going to get stopped, and as soon as you're stopped, you are one miserable thing. Because it's almost like the definition of human misery is to be paralyzed by anxiety and emotional pain, and also have no motive force forward. It's a terrible state, and so you don't want to be in that state, and you have to have an identity that's powerful enough and deeply rooted enough so the most profound doubts that might emerge about your life are met by something of equivalent force.